Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Let's make sure that everything's there. Okay, good. So, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Rose. Mrs. DeRose, nice to see you here as well. They'll be up here a little bit later. Just before we get started a little bit, I grew up in Southern California since I was the age of 9. Originally from Canada, from Toronto. My father decided to become a dentist at Loma Linda when he was 41 years of age. And I think he's probably, at least at that time, he was one of the oldest people to go through dentistry. He's currently retired. And so it was quite a culture shock for me to move from Toronto, Canada, to Loma Linda, California, growing up in the shadow of the medical center, where I didn't really know that I even wanted to be a physician. I just was growing up, and I would play in the softball league at the Loma Linda Academy, and I didn't realize that the kids I were playing with and their coaches were all doctors at the medical center. I didn't realize that until I actually went to medical school. I was like, oh, you're the baseball coach. How could you be the urologist, the chief of urology? So I started to understand a little bit more about the Adventist world, and also started to learn a little bit about the culture as well. I figured out pretty quickly that the people in Central California look down on the people in Southern California. And the people in Northern California look down on the people in Central California. And the people in Oregon look down on everybody in California. And then I learned that the people in Washington look down on the people in Oregon. So people ask me, so where are you from? And I say, Canada. Anyway, so it's good to be here. I'll tell you where my life has sort of been in the last couple of years is with this COVID-19 thing. Look, I'm a graduate of Loma Linda University. For all of its great things and failings, I didn't learn about hydrotherapy in medical school. I didn't learn about natural remedies. But I always knew, because of my Adventist upbringing, that this is something that we probably need to know about. And I remember learning about it and thinking to myself, and my wife, by the way, who's also a physician, Adventist, although didn't used to be. She was a Roman Catholic growing up. I remember saying to her, I said, Betty, we're going to be completely useless as physicians in the last days, because I'm picturing this in my mind, reading what Ellen White talks about in the last days, about how, it's going to be, usually the anticipation of something is worse than the actual thing. She's like, not with the end times. Actually, it's going to be worse than you anticipate. It's like, there's not going to be electricity. I'm picturing a world without electricity, a world without ICU rooms, ventilators. Just look and see what's happened here with a very mild COVID, a very mild case compared to what viruses could actually do. And I remember thinking, we're going to be completely useless, because I can write as many orders as I want, but if there isn't a nurse to carry it out and a ventilator to adjust, I'm going to be pretty useless. We really need to start learning a little bit more about natural remedies. And of course, it was always something on the to-do list, but never something that actually got done. And then COVID came. And COVID is, for all the bad things that COVID is, there is a silver lining with COVID, in that it starts to make us think about what's important and the things that we need to do. And so I have had my own coming to reality when I started doing these COVID-19 videos, which initially on MedCram was a channel that was designed to teach medical students and respiratory therapists and PA students how to study. Because, let's face it, students don't go to the library anymore and check out books and have a copy card. Remember the copy card we used to have at the library? Put it in the machine so we could photocopy 50 pages of an article that our teacher wanted us to study. They don't do that. They go to YouTube, they type in a subject, and they watch the shortest video they can find on that topic. That's how students learn today. And so with the huge response from not just students of medicine or respiratory therapy, but from the public wanting to learn about this disease, we sort of thrust into this. And having very little options, which we'll talk about today and tomorrow, having very little options, at least early on, started to get me to think about, well, maybe this is an opportunity that God is giving me to talk about things that we actually do know that work, and the studies that work. And we very early started talking about sleep and which is what I'm board certified in as well, and started moving on to diet and trying to introduce these topics into the vernacular, and boy, it's been eaten up. There's a desire for this. And so that's where I am today. So people like Dr. DeRose, people like I've met, you guys have been doing this for decades. And I am the Johnny come lately, okay? I have no real experience. I'm learning very quickly on this. But because of my understanding and research and my diligence in trying to find this stuff, I'm here to present to you. But by no means am I the teacher teaching the students here. We're all learning together. Because of this, I've been able to talk to a lot of people that have done a lot of research, and that's what this topic is we're going to talk about today, which is let there be light. So I'll make sure that works. I have no disclosures. I'm not getting paid by the electric company. The role today is to understand the role of melatonin in sleep, understand the role of natural sunlight in health, and understand the role of oxidative stress. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So the first words that are in the Bible is let there be light. And it says that, and it was good. And we're going to talk about exactly why that is. Because light is more than just a beautiful day. Light is more than what you see. Light is so important, we're finding out, in terms of our daily living. There's two ways that humans interact with light that we'll talk about today. There is sleep, the circadian rhythm, mood, the light that goes through your eyes, all the things that you may have heard about. But there's another aspect of light that we're just starting to understand, and that's the mitochondrial level. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So 2 parts to today's discussion. Let's talk about where this boils down to. So the mitochondria, as you know, is the powerhouse of the cell. It produces energy in the form of ATP, but it does so by breaking down 3 different types of food processes: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And this boils down into Krebs cycle, which I'm not gonna test you on a Krebs cycle, but you all know that reduced electrons, FADH, FADH2, NADH, goes to the electron transport chain, and basically the final electron acceptor is oxygen, and it's converted into water. But what you may not know is just like an engine in your car, supposing you have an ICE engine, an internal combustion engine, you have to use fuel to generate locomotion that makes your car go. Well, a byproduct of that is heat. And the same thing here in the mitochondria. The byproduct of metabolism and energy production is the formation of something we call hydroxy radicals. Radicals with single electrons. Those things are so highly reactive that even within a few angstroms of the production of these hydroxy radicals, they immediately can start to degrade the proteins in the mitochondria and cause it to break down. Just like heat in the engine can cause the engine to seize up, hydroxy radicals can cause the mitochondria to become damaged and not function appropriately. Now, why would we worry about mitochondria not working very well? Well, the reason why is because of oxidative stress, and oxidative stress is linked to a number of diseases that you might find familiar. Things like inflammation, cancer, dementia, diabetes, even learning disabilities like autism has been linked to mitochondrial damage. Okay? You'll start to see a recurring theme. These are also, by the way, the same things that are comorbidities in COVID-19. There's 2 ways that we have of limiting the heat in the engine. In other words, a cooling system like oil or your radiator. And those 2 systems are given to us that rule the night and rule the day. We know very well about the nighttime system that regulates this because we are able to figure this out because we can tell that there is melatonin that is being secreted by the pineal gland, and it comes on particularly at night, only at night, exclusively at night, and this melatonin that gets secreted into the bloodstream goes into the cells, goes into the mitochondria, and it mops up these electrons. Melatonin is more powerful as an antioxidant than glutathione. Everyone talks about glutathione. Melatonin is a much more powerful antioxidant than glutathione. In fact, melatonin has been shown to upregulate the glutathione system. It's twice as powerful as vitamin E. And so melatonin produced at night by the pineal gland goes in and bathes the mitochondria and prevents the oxidative stress. We'll talk about this later. We have myriads of data that show that lack of sleep at night, particularly in women, nurses at night, higher risk of breast cancer, all sorts of issues when you don't have enough melatonin. Okay? This is well-known information. In fact, the WHO considers nocturnal shift workers as a risk factor for cancer because of what melatonin does. So what about during the day? We know that even a slight amount of photons hitting the retina in the eye will shut down melatonin production from the brain. So how are we supposed to get melatonin into the mitochondria during the day when you're getting multiple amounts of photons hitting the retina? There is data now and there are a few scientists, Dr. Reiter and Dr. Zimmerman, both, who've published a paper, which I will show you, who have come up with a proposal based on the data that near-infrared radiation from the sun stimulates and penetrates deep down into the skin, exciting cytochrome C oxidase and other enzymes in the mitochondria to stimulate and produce melatonin at orders of magnitude higher concentration in the mitochondria than there is in the pineal gland. So here we have this system that is set up that is there to control and to cool off the engine both during the day and also at night. We're going to talk about this and break it down. The first thing we're going to talk about is light in general. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of where we're going. This represents the solar spectrum of the sun. And I want you to notice here that 54% of the energy that comes from the sun is in light that you can't even see. Near-infrared radiation there on the right-hand side. NIR, that's this area right here. Okay? We're going to be talking about near-infrared radiation from 760 nanometers to 1400 nanometers. We'll talk more about that. Notice that there's just a small amount of ultraviolet light. This UVB is what creates vitamin D, as we all know, in the skin, and the minority of light in the visible spectrum. We'll talk more about this later. So let's talk a little bit more about what happens at night. Just as a conductor has to conduct the orchestra to make sure that everybody starts at the same time, that everybody's timing is correct, in your brain is a nucleus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the conductor of all of the rhythms that happen in your body. Let me put it to you this way. I had a friend that used to work in Disneyland, and this is way back before the pandemic. He was one of the crew that went in at night. Do you know that Disneyland is as busy or even busier at night than it is during the day? All of the gardening, all of the cleaning, all of the restocking happens at night. It's a 24-hour-a-day business. So that when you have guests that are coming to the happiest place on earth in the morning, it's ready to do business. And so I'll tell you something, the human body is far more complicated than Disneyland. And so the same thing happens. We have a circadian rhythm. We have a clock that determines when the best things for things to happen. Imagine if the cleaning crew went in at 11 o'clock in the morning. Do you think the CEO would be happy? No, they have to have a very special appearance. There can be no supporting staff during the day because it has to have that illusion of a magical place. And so the cleaning crew, the gardeners, all of that stuff has to be at night when no one's there. This is the same thing that happens in the human body. There is a time when damaged organelles are broken down, and there is a time when things are opening up. There's a time to eat, there's a time to fast, there's a time to sleep, there's a time to be awake. And these things are set very specifically on the circadian rhythm. Things have to happen in unison, otherwise, instead of Beethoven's Fifth, you get one of those modern pieces of music that we're used to hearing on the radio. Okay? Do you understand what I'm saying? And so what you're going to see is this recurring theme this weekend is that the human body is designed in a very specific way to have things done in a very specific fashion. And we in the West have developed a lot of technology that allows us to do things whenever we want to. That may not be the best for our system. We can go to Denny's 24 hours a day. That may not be the best for our system. We can turn night into day. That may not be the best for our system. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, let's talk about the eye. There is these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that are particularly in the inferior retina that can sense light, and they send it not to the occipital lobe where you actually look at light. They send it to parts of your brain which do not detect light per se, but understand that there is light. So this is what we would call subconscious light exposure. And this subconscious light exposure is very important because it's how the master clock, located here in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, tells all of the other clocks in the body exactly when to run and when not to run, and when things should be happening. Interesting about the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, they're only in the inferior portion of the retina. And that means, as you may recall from optics, that corresponds with the superior visual field. So light, particularly in the upper quadrants of your vision, are going to be very sensitive at telling your brain what time of day it is. And as you can see here, there is a negative feedback to the pineal gland, so that if there is stimulation of the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which, by the way, like particularly blue light, but is responsive to all types of light, it will shut down melatonin production from the pineal gland. When there is no melatonin being produced in the pineal gland, the body interprets that as it's day. So what does it involve with the regulation of circadian rhythm? This suprachiasmatic nucleus involves things with peripheral clocks, circulating melatonin, which has been tied to cortisol production, antioxidants, sleep, fasting and feeding rhythms, cholecystokinin, leptin, ghrelin. These are hormones that tell you when to eat, when not to eat. Body temperature, pancreas and glucose metabolism, vasopressin, acetylcholine, cortisol, insulin, adiponectin, Does this stuff sound familiar? Do we have a problem in the United States with this kind of stuff? Yes, we do. I remember once there was a video where they went to Africa, and they asked these guys living in rural Africa, they asked these guys in their 60s or 70s, do you have a problem sleeping? They said, no, why would I have a problem sleeping? Do you know what the incidences of insomnia is in the United States? 25%. We have a hard time sleeping in the United States. We'll talk about that right now, why that might be the case. They've done studies in rodents and humans. Whenever you mess up the circadian rhythm, in other words, if you present light when the body thinks it should be dark, or vice versa, reduced body temperature, increased adipocity, altered immune responses, tumor development, perturbed hormone homeostasis. In humans, unscheduled secretion of insulin, leptin, norepinephrine, increased markers of insulin resistance, inflammation. All of these things. I'll tell you straight off, your insulin is intrinsically more sensitive in the morning than it is in the evening. If you had the same meal in the morning versus the same meal in the evening, your blood sugars are going to be higher in the evening than they were in the morning. We're not even talking about what you're eating. We're just talking about when you're eating it. Just when. And we know that higher blood sugars are tied to worsening cardiovascular outcomes. So we're just talking about the whens. We haven't even gotten into the whats, or the quality, or even the quantity. Just the whens. This is really important stuff. So here is the circadian rhythm according to the brain at the top. There's a portion there where you should be awake, which is depicted in terms of orange. And then there is the part that is blue, which is when it should be sleeping. And you can see here that it's perfectly superimposed with reality, which is when the sun is down and the sun is up. This is what your circadian rhythm would look like if you were living on a desert island without electricity. You would be perfectly succumbed to the sun coming up and the sun going down. Okay? But what has Western society done to us? This is what it's done. Computers, smartphones, tablets, all of these things that we expose our eyes to at night. And so what the body does is when your eyes are being exposed to light, you're shutting down melatonin production. And furthermore, on top of all of that, the master clock is saying, this is kind of like, if you're the conductor of an orchestra and the drummer is kind of speeding up a little bit. To avoid a disaster, what does the conductor have to do? He has to speed up a little bit, right? So what the circadian rhythm clock is seeing here is there is light at the end of the circadian rhythm daytime period. That must mean that the circadian rhythm has to adjust itself and delay itself. And that's what it does. The circadian rhythm, suprachiasmatic nucleus, when it's exposed to light at night, will delay the clock. So you get something like this. It shifts. Do you see how it just shifted there? It shifts to the right. And as it shifts to the right, it's delaying itself. And in other words, instead of you becoming sleepy normally at 9 o'clock at night, you're now becoming sleepy at 11 o'clock at night. And instead of being ready to take on the day at 6 o'clock in the morning, your body now says, no, I need to take on the day at 8 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning. So what would you get? What were the kind of symptoms that you would get? You would get the symptoms of insomnia at night. because you want to go to bed at a regular hour, but your body is not ready for sleep because your circadian rhythm has become delayed because you're exposing your eyes to bright light. Does this make sense? And when the alarm goes off at 6 o'clock in the morning, you have something called sleep inertia. And do you know what happens when you have sleep inertia? Do you know what happens when millions of people have sleep inertia? Starbucks stock goes up. That's what happens when you have sleep inertia. And these are the symptoms that we're seeing in this country. Do you see people in Africa lining up for Starbucks? I remember once I took a flight out of LAX, and it was an early flight in the morning. It was around 6 o'clock, and I was sitting there in the terminal, and the Starbucks opened up, and I am not exaggerating. There were 30 people in line to get a cup of coffee. 30 people. I counted it. I was going to take a picture, but I thought that would be a little bit too. So this is the problem. Light after sunset tends to delay your circadian rhythm by suppressing melatonin production in the pineal gland. This causes your body to delay sleep onset. Now, how do you reverse this? Light early when you wake up tends to advance your circadian rhythm, but requires more intensity because those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that are sensitive to light are extremely sensitive to light in the evening, so it just takes a little bit of light to start to delay your circadian rhythm. But they are less sensitive in the morning when you really want to expose them to bright light. And by exposing them to bright light in the morning, you can actually start to shift your circadian level back. Yes?
What period of time does the exposure to bright light shut down the melatonin production?
The question is from what period of time does it start to shut down melatonin production? There's something called dim light melatonin onset, and that DMLCO, you call it, is part of your circadian rhythm. For most people, that starts at around 8, 9 o'clock at night, about an hour before you normally go to bed. So when the sun goes down, that's when the clock starts to sort of tick.
But if you have the lights on, like how much?
You're shutting down melatonin production for when it would normally come on. Yeah, so the question is when do you start shutting it down? When the sun, so you'll see this over and over again. I'm glad you asked this question because you'll see this again. When the sun goes down after 9 o'clock, that's when you should be going down. Okay? Yeah. Dim light melatonin onset. Dim light, DLMO. It's the technical term that's used in the literature. Dim light melatonin onset. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Yes?
As you well know, coming from Canada, up here in this part of the country, the sun can set as early as 4 o'clock in winter, but the sun sets as late as 9 o'clock at night.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I remember once my wife told me that when she was 16 years old, she took a trip by herself and went to Copenhagen, and she had a layover there. Her family's in Poland, and she remember setting the alarm because she needed to get on the plane the next morning in the hotel at 9 o'clock, and so she at 10 o'clock, and so she set her alarm for 11 or something like that. Anyway, she woke up, she looked at the clock, it was 11 o'clock, she looked outside, the sun was up, and she freaked out. And she went downstairs, she's like 16 years old, she goes to the clerk, "You were supposed to wake me up, I missed my flight." She's like, "Calm down, when's your flight?" She's like, it's the 28th. Well, it's still the 27th. And then she realized the sun was still up because it was 11 o'clock at night and the sun was still up in that kind of a high. So you're absolutely right. The other thing as well is realize that if you want early morning light, the sun might not be coming up until 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, especially at these kind of latitudes. We have an answer for all of that. We've anticipated that question. So the other thing I wanted to show you real quickly, we'll get to that, is not only does light in the retina go to the suprachiasmatic nucleus to affect the circadian rhythm, but it also goes to something called the perihabenular nucleus. Now, why is that important? Well, as you can see there in parentheses, this is the area of the brain that actually is involved with mood. And so there's something called seasonal affective disorder. People, about 5 to 10% of the population will get seasonal affective disorder because they're not getting enough light stimulation to that part of the brain, and they need to actually have that. Here's a really interesting study that looked at an e-reader. How many people use e-readers to read books? Here's the comparison in terms of the amount of lux going to the eye in an e-reader. You can see here This is the amount of light in the e-reader in terms of irradiance over a wavelength period, and this is what a low light hitting a regular book that you might read is down here. So bottom line is that I would not use e-readers at night if you're going to read. Okay? And here's the reason why. It's because, again, that light is going to delay the circadian rhythm, and it's going to make you go to bed later. In that very same study, they looked at what the sleep latency was. How fast did it take for them to get to sleep? And you can see with the book, the sleep latency was only about 16 or 17 minutes, which is normal. But for those that were using the low-energy e-book, the sleep latency was 25 minutes. That may not seem like a big deal, but that's a significant difference. As you can see there, that was statistically significant. So, what should you do in the morning? This gets back to your question. So, you should be exposing your eyes to bright sunlight before 9 o'clock in the morning. This is going to anchor your circadian rhythm. If it's already delayed, it's going to advance it better. You're going to feel better. You're going to be more able to fall asleep at night. And it's going to kick into, it's going to basically ground your conductor so it knows when the circadian rhythm is. Now, you can get this with full sun. There is still light that comes through the clouds. For those of you who know anything about photography, if you know that the amount of light inside of a house is considerably less than it is outside. If you set up an aperture on your camera and then take it outside, it's going to be just full white. Now, you don't realize it as a human being because your brain and your eyes automatically adjust for that because you can adjust depending on different light settings. But there is several times more light outside. So highly recommend going outside early in the morning to get as much sun as possible. No sunglasses, windows, windshields. How much do you need? So we use the word lux as in terms of how much light. And there's a technical definition of that. I'm not going to get into that. But you need about 3,000 lux, lux hours. So there's many different ways of getting that. You can buy a 10,000 lux light box and sit about 15 inches away from it. And if you do that for about 20 to 30 minutes, which is a third of an hour, you're going to get 3,000 lux in an hour. And that's going to be your dose. If you go outside and it's a bright sunny day before 9 o'clock in the morning, that's about 100,000 lux. So you only need to be out there for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. That's all you need. Do you see what I'm saying? So understanding this in terms of how much there is, that's going to be stimulating those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Remember, where are they? They're in the inferior retinal ganglion, and therefore it needs to be in the superior aspect of the sky. Don't stare at the sun. Just go outside. You'll get plenty of light. Okay? And what should you do in the evening? Limit light as much as possible after sunset. Get your lights on dimmers. Put them down low, because what happens if the light is up? If you have ceiling lights, that's going to be hitting the inferior retinal ganglion. If you have low-level lights, that's going to be reflecting up into first of all, it's going to be dim, number one. Number two, it's going to be going to the superior retinal ganglion, where there are no intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. Now, because they typically are more sensitive in the blue, there is an idea that maybe we should shift the spectrum of these lights in the evening toward the red. Now, think about this. You want low light, you want it low in your visual field, and you want it as red as possible. Does anyone know what that sounds like to me? Sunset! The good Lord has already given us this type of light at night. And even when the sun goes down, what did people hundreds of years ago do outside to build if you wanted to have warmth and light? Fire. It's low down. It's generally low in intensity. And what? It's in the red. This is not rocket science, okay? And by the way, what kind of other type of light comes out of a fire that we just talked about very briefly at the beginning? Infrared. So you're getting your melatonin that way too. Do you see this? Okay, there's more. Okay, so what should you do in the evening? Well, we already sort of went over this. This is more specific, okay? So blue block light, you could wear the blue blockers at night, but it's better just not to have any light at all. Okay, turn off all your electronic devices. They're just not good. All right, so we're going to move on to the second aspect. So we talked about how light interacts with us in terms of sleep, circadian rhythm, move. We could spend a whole other 2 hours on that. But the bottom line is that light, when it's up, is good for your eyes in terms of mood, circadian rhythm, having all of those things tied together, making sure that you're on track. Let's talk about mitochondrial. So you guys know the mitochondria. You learned that in cells, pretty basic stuff. We talked about this already. Oxidative stress, less optimal health happens when your mitochondria are not working very well. We've talked about what happens in the night with the pineal gland and melatonin. Now we're going to talk about what happens in the day. So there was this paper that was published by Scott Zimmerman, who is a light engineer, and Russell Ryder, who is the editor of the journal Melatonin and probably one of the world's foremost experts in melatonin research out of San Antonio, Texas. And he ran this article review called Melatonin and the Optics of the Human Body. It is mind-blowing what I'm about to show you. So melatonin is produced, we know that melatonin is produced in mitochondria in response to sunlight and provides targeted protection of mitochondria from reactive oxygen species. Accordingly, melatonin is protective against a range of diseases characterized by mitochondrial dysfunction, including cancers, neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. Does this list of diseases sound familiar to you? May have a role in the prevention and or treatment of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and even COVID-19. So this is a quote from their paper. Quote, "It has now been shown that the mitochondria produce melatonin in many cells in quantities which are orders of magnitude higher than produced in the pineal gland. This subcellular melatonin does not necessarily fluctuate with our circadian clock or release into the circulatory system, but instead has been proposed to be consumed locally in response to free radical density within each cell, in particular in response to near-infrared exposure." They go on. "Based on the optical and biological review of the literature, it is proposed that the NIR portion of natural sunlight stimulates an excess of antioxidants in each of our healthy cells, and that the cumulative effect of this antioxidant reservoir is to enhance the body's ability to rapidly and locally deal with changing conditions throughout the day. In this approach, the role of the circulatory melatonin produced by the pineal gland is to provide an efficient method of delivering supplemental melatonin during periods of low cellular activity and solar stimulus to damage or aging cells, that would be at night, in both diurnal and nocturnal animals. While circulatory melatonin may be the hormone of darkness, at night, sleeping, pineal gland, melatonin in the blood, going into the cells, subcellular melatonin, mitochondrial melatonin, may be the, quote, hormone of daylight." Again, we're talking about near-infrared radiation. Yes?
How does sunscreen affect that?
Not at all. Sunscreen, so we're going to talk about that. Near-infrared radiation will penetrate your clothes. If you can feel the warmth of sunlight, then you're getting near-infrared radiation. It's the same thing next to a fire. The way we sense near-infrared radiation is by warmth. That should tell you right there that it's penetrating not only your clothes, but your skin, and it's going deep into the subcutaneous tissue and affecting heat responses inside your body.
So even through glass?
We'll talk about glass. Yeah, we're going to talk about all of that. So it can penetrate into the epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous tissue. Why is that? You guys remember when you pull up to a stop and those teenagers pull up next to you playing what they call music? Yeah, right? What do you feel? Boom, boom. It's the low frequency sounds that you're hearing. And that's exactly the same thing with light. Low frequency light, near infrared radiation, can highly penetrate a lot of these things. Yeah? Yeah, yes, somewhat. We'll talk about that. Yeah. So this is what the solar spectrum looks like. As a physicist, this would look familiar. So in this narrow band here of visible light, you can see that there is a narrow amount of energy. All of this to the right of this bar is near-infrared energy that comes from the sun that is hitting us when we go outside. And then that small part to the left is ultraviolet radiation. So you can see here a light spectrometer that the more red and near red it is, the deeper it's going to penetrate. In fact, this is what nurses use today to be able to shine light on someone's arm to find the veins. It penetrates deeply down enough into the vein and then bounces back so you can see the vein even though it's under the surface of the skin. Here's part of the research that they did. You can see here that they proposed that this near-infrared radiation can penetrate even up to 8 centimeters into the skin. So imagine at all points of your body penetrating down to 8 centimeters. That's the majority of the cells in your body, right? That's a huge amount. Here's an example of visible light versus near-infrared light. You can see the hand on the left is what you would normally see. What do you see on the right? You see veins. You see blood vessels. That's deep inside. That's because the near-infrared is able to penetrate that deeply and then come back again. Here's a proposal of what they're saying in terms of human cells that are seen. So the black line represents the number of cells in a human body as they age. And this would confirm what many of us know, that after the age of 20, everything is downhill. But the red line is the amount of cells that could be exposed to near-infrared radiation if you're out in the sun. That's the majority of the cells, right? There's some cells that are just so deep that they're not going to see that. But you can see very clearly that that's the case. Now, this is the part that really blows me away, because of that, what they are proposing is this, is that near-infrared radiation can actually penetrate the human skull, go into the gray matter, and improve the energy utilization in the mitochondria in gray matter cells. And not only that, but that the way that the gray matter is folded, it acts as a harvester of light that can get the light rebounding down into the sulci and the gyri so that the entire outside portion of the brain can be stimulated and stimulated by near-infrared radiation. In fact, the cerebral spinal fluid, this is physics, the cerebral spinal fluid acts as a diffuser to take the light, diffuse the light around the brain, and then the sulci and gyri, which increase the surface area of the brain, take that light and actually activate, if you will, the gray matter. It's the gray matter that's on the outside, not the white matter. Does that sound crazy? It does sound crazy. And I have to admit, I was a little bit skeptical until I looked at this. Do you remember from medical school? How do you determine whether or not somebody has a sinus infection? This is regular light. This is not even near-infrared radiation. You put the light on the sinus, and you can do transillumination of the sinus. So there's no question that light can penetrate the skull. Even visible light can penetrate the skull. And this is just the pen light. We're not talking about light from the sun. I'll show you data that shows that people who spend more time out in the sun actually have more gray matter. And this goes through hats, by the way. This is near-infrared radiation. So this is what I'm telling. There is. Can I just give you a little commercial here? We as Adventists we used to think, or maybe I'm generalizing, that the way to health is exclusively through diet. If you have a car and you change the oil and if you have a car and you think it's all about putting the right octane of fuel into the car, but you never change the oil and you never replace the brakes and you never rotate the tires, do you think you're going to have a good effect on the car? Maybe there's more to good health and diet, or good health, than just diet. And if we're really focusing on one area but completely negating the other area, we're maybe not going to get the same benefit. Correct? I think this is really big. And I think we've been missing out on this. It gets even better, guys, because near-infrared radiation that comes from the sun, when it comes from the sun and hits the earth, do you know what types of products reflect the highest amount of near-infrared radiation? Green plants and grass. In fact, this is from Zimmerman and Ryder. They have no knowledge about Ellen White. What they're saying here is that most blue, green, and red materials have very high NIR reflectance, so that the amount of light that's coming to you, if you're out in green nature, there's a lot more near-infrared radiation coming from that environment than just the sun itself. The plants take what they need, and they reflect back what you need. This is a near-infrared photography of green space. It looks like there's snow everywhere because there's a high intensity of light coming from grass and trees and plants. This is just a regular photograph, except with a near-infrared filter on it. This is Central Park. What are the buildings? black. It's what happens when you live in a concrete jungle. Versus Central Park, which is alight with near-infrared radiation. Look, we've got data upon data. We've had data for over 100 years that people who live in green spaces do much better. Here's a meta-analysis. There's no question. Do you know that in the United States, we have data going back over 100 years that is clear, that shows that the amount of natural sunlight that students get when they're learning improves learning. And to the point where there's actual directives about how big the windows have to be in schools. That goes back over 100 years. It's because we know the data. We just didn't know why. But we're starting to figure this out. Here's what I like to call a notable health reformer from the 1800s. This is my favorite term when I go on to MedCram and talk about Ellen White. Trees with medicinal properties. The Lord has been giving me light in regard to many things. He has shown me that our sanitarium should be erected on as high an elevation as necessary to secure the best results, and that they ought to be surrounded by extensive tracts of land, beautified by flowers and ornamental trees. It's basically the solar panels reflecting that near-infrared to us. In certain places, preparations were being made to clear the land for an erection of a sanitarium. Light was given me, I love how the fact that she uses the word light. Light was given me that there is health in the fragrance of the pine, the cedar, and the fir. We'll talk about that in the next talk. And there are several other kinds of trees that have medicinal properties and are health promoting. Here's a table from a senior thesis project summarizing the impacts of daylight in preschool students. And what they're showing here is the benefit of what they call daylighting on students. Health, vitamin D, students' vision, calcium absorption, bone formation, biological clock, the mood, being cheerful, student attendance, sleep. Everything on this page has been shown to be linked to more sunlight. Violent behavior goes down, stress goes down, security needs go down, depression goes down, fatigue goes down. Shining the light on sunshine, a systemic review of influence of sun exposure on type 2 diabetes mellitus-related outcomes. So what they did was they looked around the country, they did a meta-analysis, and they were able to show in this study that type 2 diabetes incidence was tied to sunlight exposure. The more sunlight you had, the less likely you were to have the diabetes. Here's a paper that was published. This is an amazing paper. So they looked at two cohorts. This is the Oxford Biobank cohort in UK and the Netherlands cohort of obesity study in Leiden, Netherlands. And what they did was something really interesting. They took these patients, they said, go get blood tests. Go get blood tests on diabetes, go get blood tests on metabolism, on cholesterol, just go get your blood tests. And they recorded the date when they got the blood test. And then what they did was they used the weather reports in the previous 7 days before they got the blood test. And they were able to show that the more sunlight that there was coming in on the weather report in the 7 days prior to when they got their blood test correlated perfectly with the results of that blood test in terms of all of the data. This is an example. So glucose metabolism, glucose percent, insulin, something called HOMA, which is basically a measure of metabolic health, LDL, HDL, all of these things were correlated with how much sunlight happened to be coming through on the weather report in the previous 7 days before. All right, let's talk about sunlight a little bit more. Sunlight, you say, well, what about melanoma? Well, what about skin damage, all that sort of stuff? So the most damaging type of light is not infrared, but rather ultraviolet. As you can see here, this is the amount of hydroxy radicals that are produced with light. As you may recall, a very small portion of the light that comes through is in the ultraviolet spectrum. But it's the highest in energy, and therefore it causes the most damage, as you can see here on this graph. So let's take a look at this. Here's an interesting paper that was published looking at sun exposure and mortality from melanoma. Notice the things that were associated with an increased risk of death in melanoma. It was the melanoma thickness, if they saw mitoses on histology, if there was ulceration, or if it was in the head and the neck area. What were the things that were associated with decreased death? Sunburn. Well, you've got to be in the sun to get a sunburn, right? High intermittent sun exposure associated with a decreased mortality. And solar elastosis. Solar elastosis is something that happens, it's basically like sun damage. So sun damage as a surrogate for sun exposure actually had a reduction in the mortality of melanoma. Have we been sold a bill of goods in terms of getting out of the sun? Avoid the sun? I think we might have been. Avoidance of sun exposure is a what? Risk factor for all-cause mortality. Results from the melanoma in southern Sweden cohort. Almost 30,000 women were selected at random in southern Sweden, followed prospectively over 20 years. They had about 2,500 deaths at the end of 20 years, and they asked them previously what was their type of behavior in terms of the sun. And this is what they showed. They showed that people that had avoiding sun exposure had higher mortality or lower mean survival. So sun exposure improved survival. Interdependence on contributions of sun exposure and vitamin D to MRI, measures in multiple sclerosis. By the way, how many of you know that multiple sclerosis is associated with latitude? Okay? I remember growing up in Canada, as I told you, and we had big drives at our school. Raise money for multiple sclerosis research. And then I moved down to California. I never heard the word multiple sclerosis ever again until I went to medical school. Oh yeah, remember, we raised money for that. What is that again? It's latitude. It has a lot to do with latitude. So this group tried to see whether or not, what would happen if we exposed them to sunlight. So here we have multiple sclerosis patients in the upper part of the page, and we have controls in the lower part of the page. And then we divide them up into quartiles of summer sun exposure. And what we're looking at here is gray matter volume of the brain on the left graphs, and we're looking at whole brain volume on the right side. What do you notice here? You got bigger brains when you're out in the sun. And it doesn't matter whether you're multiple sclerosis patients or whether you're control patients. Why would that be? Well, I think we may have a handle on that based on Russell Ryder and Scott Zimmerman. Is it possible that near-infrared radiation is penetrating the skull, that the cerebral spinal fluid is picking this up? I mean, they showed this in vitro. They showed this outside of the body using materials, that this could happen. And now we have data that shows that it actually happens in people in life using MRI technology. What about COVID-19? I mean, this is not rocket science, guys. We have a flu season, and it usually happens when the sun is going down. Every October through March, we see an increase in viruses. And that's when the sun starts to dip down in the sky and we have longer nights and shorter days. Well, is it because of that, or is it because of humidity? Or maybe it's because of temperature. Well, here's a study that was done, published in the very prestigious journal Nature. Autumn COVID-19 surge dates in Europe correlates to latitudes, but not temperature, humidity, pointing to vitamin D as a contributing factor. This is back when you would associate vitamin D with sunshine only. Before we go on, I would say it would be a mistake for anybody in here to conclude that taking supplemental vitamin D means that you don't have to go out in the sun. Check this out. So when they looked at when the surge of COVID-19 in Europe started. Who did it start with first? When did the surge start? And then they mapped it out based on their latitude, and based on their humidity at the time, and based on temperature. In terms of temperature, it was a flat line. There's absolutely no correlation. You can see that right here. The R squared was 0.00. For humidity, 0.00. For latitude, it was almost a perfect correlation, starting with Finland and ending with Greece. It's latitude. So is it vitamin D? Well, let's talk about that. We know in the cells that angiotensin II, which is a pro-oxidant, goes to angiotensin 1,7, which is an antioxidant. That's very important. You're taking something that promotes inflammation and turning it into something that reduces inflammation. Do you think that's a very important process? That's a very important process. Guess what enzyme mediates that process? ACE2. ACE2. And when the virus hits ACE2, it completely incapacitates it. And so what you have is, instead of ACE2 causing an increase in angiotensin 1,7 and a reduction in angiotensin 2, you have the opposite. And as a result of that, angiotensin 2 builds up and causes more reactive oxygen species, and angiotensin 1,7 goes down, releasing its negative effect on reactive oxygen species. But wait, there's more. For $29.99, you get the virus that stimulates, that not only hits the ACE2 receptor, shutting it down, but it also attracts white blood cells to the area, and they release reactive oxygen species as well. Now, how do we already know how to mitigate reactive oxygen species. And it's important to know that because reactive oxygen species leads to blood clots, and blood clots can lead to hypoxemia. We know that during the evening, melatonin is very powerful at relieving reactive oxygen species. And now during the day, we're at least looking at data that means that melatonin during the day, intramitochondrially, which is where all this is happening, may be a way of looking at it. So what about data instead of theories? Well, here's a study that was published looking at 60 patients admitted to the hospital. They measured 3 things. Number 1, glutathione, which looks at the antioxidants in the cell. They looked at T-bars, which is a measure of oxidative stress. And they looked at something called F2 isoprostane, which is a marker of oxidative damage. This is what they found. Notice that as you get older, the amount of antioxidants in your body goes down. Okay? This is just a natural process of getting older. Right? Okay? And notice the difference between control and COVID. Those with COVID had much lower levels of antioxidants. Don't know if that's the cause or if that's the result, but it was there. Now, what about oxidative stress going on? Notice that oxidative stress goes up as you get older. And notice also that those who had COVID had much higher levels of oxidative stress. Now, finally, let's look at damage. The surrogate for oxidative damage is F2 isoprostane. Notice that damage goes up as you get older, and notice also that patients with COVID had higher levels of oxidative damage. Vitamin D. We know, it's clear, that people with lower levels of vitamin D have worse outcomes with COVID. We don't know if that's the cause or the result, or if it's just associated. We don't know. We need to do randomized placebo-controlled trials that show that it improves. And right now, those studies are mixed. But here's a very interesting study. Here's a study that was published in the British Journal of Dermatology, very prestigious journal, and they looked at that very question. And what they did is they said, okay, we know that vitamin D may be beneficial in terms of COVID-19. Let's take a look and see if sunlight without vitamin D might be beneficial. How did they do that? They eliminated the portions of the planet where you could make enough vitamin D in the wintertime, and they said, we're not going to look at people there. So notice for the map of the United States, they completely blanked out the part where I live, because you can actually get enough vitamin D by going outside into the sun, even in the wintertime. Anything south of the southern border of Tennessee, pretty much, you can get enough sunshine. So they looked at people up here, where you can't get enough vitamin D with the amount of sunlight. And do you know what they found? That even if you're not getting enough vitamin D, that sunlight mattered. That getting enough sunlight, even though you're not getting enough vitamin D, still showed an improvement in COVID-19 outcomes. They took that and they a priori, they looked at people in England, and then they did it again in Italy, and they found exactly the same results. Which means that sunlight, even outside of vitamin D, is doing something to people to prevent them from getting poor outcomes in terms of COVID-19. This is what they said. They said, in conclusion, this study is observational, and therefore any causal interpretation needs to be taken with caution. However, if the relationship identified proves to be causal, it suggests that optimizing sun exposure may be a possible public health intervention. That's a very bold statement. Given the effect that it appears independent of vitamin D pathway, it suggests possible new COVID-19 therapies. I can think of a new COVID-19 therapy that's actually really old. Getting out in the sunshine. These are pictures of hospitals that would do this. We knew what this was back then. They actually had built hospitals, as you can see there, for patients to go outside and get sunlight. This was the main therapy in the tuberculosis sanitariums. That's why they built them up high. because they found out that it seems to work at high altitude, whether it was the lack of oxygen or maybe more vitamin D coming through because there was less atmosphere to absorb the ultraviolet radiation. We don't know, but they knew it worked. We don't do this anymore. We build hospitals with small little windows and windows that don't allow near-infrared radiation in. Although there are some hospitals that have a lot of light coming in now. I've been to the new Loma Linda hospital. It's almost entirely built of glass, yes.
Has there been any study looking at artificial light that has a spectrum?
Yes, and that's where Scott Zimmerman comes in. He's actually looking at, he's actually making a company that's making lights, we'll talk about it, that is full spectrum lights. But this is the problem, is the reason why you have LED lights is because there's no energy in those lights going to the near infrared. That's why they're so energy efficient. You're only making visible light on those LED lights. You used to get plenty, I'll show you here, you used to get plenty of light. So what have we learned so far? We have learned that it's important to get out into the sunshine. It's important that there are health benefits to getting natural light. And we've also, when the sun is up, but we've also shown that it's also equally important to make sure that when the sun goes down, that we're not getting light. It's really interesting to me because it's kind of like the close of probation. Everybody eventually is going to see the light, correct? Doesn't it say that every knee shall bow and every tongue will confess? Those people that see the light before the sun goes down are going to be much better off than those people that see the light after the sun goes down. But we're all going to see the light. Better to see the light early. Health Reformer, May 1st, 1871. The feeble one should press out into the sunshine as earnestly and naturally as do the shaded plants and vines. The pale and sickly grain blade that has struggled up out of the cold of early spring puts out the natural and healthy, deep green after enjoying for a few days the health and life-giving rays of the sun. Go out into the light and warmth of the glorious sun, you pale and sickly ones, and share with the vegetation its life-giving, health-dealing power. On the other side, she says, make it a habit not to sit up after 9 o'clock. Every light should be extinguished. This turning night into day is a wretched, health-destroying habit. Did she say that if you're a vegetarian, you can mitigate these effects? If you put 91 octane into your sports car but don't change the oil, is the sports car going to go very far? There's multiple aspects to keeping a complicated system going, and it's more than just diet. It's more than just being a vegetarian. It has its place. Read the owner's manual, put the right fuel in the car, but then don't forget about the oil. Don't forget about rotating the tires, changing the brakes. This is what the daytime of the lens of near-infrared radiation looks like on the right. This is what we used to grow up in the wheat fields. This is what it looks like on the left in our homes, schools, and offices. There's no infrared radiation coming in at all. Fluorescence, 0. Near LEDs, 0. This is the amount of near infrared exposure that we've had over the last 200 years in this country, from 1800 all the way down to the present. 7% of our daily lives are spent outside. We go from the bedroom to the kitchen, to the car, to the office, and most of us come back after the sun goes down, back to the car, to the kitchen, back to the bedroom, every day, day in, day out. And if you if you make sure that you've got an office window, guess what? The windows that we put in now, they're called low E. Do you know why they're called low E? It's because the people who decide what kind of windows to put in the buildings are the owners of the buildings that have to pay the energy bill, not the people that work in the buildings. Does that make sense? So this is what happens. This is basically to show you that the LED bulbs and they don't emit any near infrared radiation whatsoever. This is to show you that the new low E glass doesn't allow near infrared radiation through it. There's different types, but basically the ones that they're putting in now, it's because they don't want heat coming into the building to pay a lot of energy costs to air condition the building. That makes sense, right? So just because you're sitting next to the glass and the sun's hitting you, if you are feeling warm rays, then you're getting near infrared radiation. If you're not feeling warm rays, you're not getting it. Okay? This is what it used to look like in our history on the left. Campfire, lights in the sky, low in the thing, right? But this is what we have on the right. We have Times Square. We have all sorts of light, and it's very high up in the sky. We have street lights. This is the difference. So as the sun comes up, I know we're going to wrap up here, but as the sun comes up, because the sun has to go through so much atmosphere, only near-infrared radiation is coming. So as the sun is coming up, you're getting this boost of near-infrared radiation. Your cells are making more melatonin. They're getting ready for the day. And they've had this big bank of melatonin. And then as the sun hits 10 o'clock and goes to 2 o'clock, now the ultraviolet radiation's coming in, but you've built up this melatonin bank so you can survive the onslaught, but you need the ultraviolet because you need to make what? Vitamin D. And then any damage that might have occurred as the onslaught goes down, the sun passes 2 o'clock, now you're making more melatonin again to repair the stresses of the day. As the sun goes down and it sets, you're getting near-infrared, almost exclusively near-infrared radiation. Okay, that's on the left. On the right, what do we see? We're not seeing anything. There's no infrared radiation coming in at all. And when we go to our offices, you're getting these HEV photons coming from ultraviolet light that may come through at a very low level, but you're not able to mitigate those. And so you get this low free radicals all the time. You know, I've heard stories of people who hire gardeners, and they say, these guys come out, they're working out day and they eat the worst garbage you can possibly imagine. They're eating red meat, they're going home and drinking it, and they're indestructible. They just keep going and going and going. And it's like, this is the reason, this must be the reason why. They're putting garbage into their gas tank, but they're changing the oil every 2,000 miles. They're rotating the tires. You see what I'm saying? Wouldn't it be great if we did all of those things? So we talked about 2 ways of how humans interact with light. I think there's a lot of key points to take home here. There's a lot of information that we went through. But I think the key here is that you've got to realize that our circadian rhythm is telling us that there are the optimal times of the day to do certain things. There are optimal times when the light should be off, and there are optimal times when you should be in the sun. We're not going to talk too much about time-restricted feeding, but we could do that this weekend. But guess what? The same thing in terms of eating. There's an optimal time to eat, and there's an optimal time not to eat. And the Lord has made our body in this way, and we've been given instructions. And science is now coming forward and saying these things, but let's face it, folks, we've known this for some time. So with that, I will wrap up. Overall here, just a review, get as much natural sunlight, direct or indirect as possible, avoiding glass in between after waking up. Exposure to low-level red light at suntime is advisable, and avoid any type of light exposure after sunset, especially blue light, and especially 1 to 2 hours prior to bedtime. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you very much.